everybody, and welcome to Limited Level Ups. I'm Alex, and this week's episode is our Brothers War set overview. This is the episode that I do every set that I describe as sort of a condensed set review. For those who don't want to or don't have time to get through a full 8 hours worth of full set reviews, or maybe you've listened to those already and you're content fiends that just want more, this is the episode for you. So today we're going to be going through the set's themes, what works, what doesn't, big picture ideas, archetypes, talk, comments, all that good stuff to help you get ready for pre-release and for your first drafts. Just like in the last two sets, I've had the privilege of actually playing in the streamer early access event before everybody else gets their hand on the card. So I've got about 7 drafts, I think, under my belt. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today isn't just pure speculation. It is indeed informed by some of my experiences. So, that's kind of cool too. If you haven't heard the full set review with me and Lord Tupperware Ethan, that's on the Limited Level Ups podcast feed. It's also on the Lords of Limited YouTube channel if you want the visuals for that. I'm happy to say yesterday when I was streaming for the early access event, a lot of people were like, is there anything that's like massively changed about your card evaluations after the set review? And I think like 80 or 90% of the cards I feel relatively, confident that we got right, at least in the right ballpark, So if you've listened to that, a lot of those ideas carry over, and some of the ones that maybe we missed on slightly, I'm going to touch on today. Before we get into all of that, of course, I want to shout out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. I know you probably hear a lot of podcasts talking about Patreon, but it really is the number one way that keeps the show going. So if you want to support this podcast, anything that I do, any of my content, head over to patreon.com/limitedlevelups. Also, of course, we want to give back to you. There's a Discord that goes along with that. The Discord is free, but there's secret channels in there for people that are patrons, all the way down to the $1 tier. All of the tiers, there's like $1, $2, $3, $4, $5, $10 tiers, all aim to get you better at Limited in some way. That's my goal. That's my ethos. I want everybody listening to get better at the game if that's what their goals are. And we've got coaching tiers. We've got deck log and draft review tiers where you can post to those secret channels of the Discord, get some help, especially with a new set coming out. No better time, I think. You can solve the format really quick, really get your footing. You don't have to putz around for the first few weeks. So check that out if you're interested in supporting the show or interested in, getting better at Limited. Okay, let us dive in. Okay, so I want to start off today by talking about the mechanics of the set. I think covering those best paints a picture of what this set is about. The synergies in this set almost exclusively revolve around the set's 3 main mechanics, which are Power Stones, Prototype, and Unearth. There are synergies that you're going to find focused in particular color pairs, like blue-white has a soldier theme, black-red has sacrifice, like it often does. But those are light themes, and even for those, a lot of them are just derivatives of those 3 main mechanics. So, for example, it's like Black-Red's thing is sacrifice. Well, it's like sacrificing Power Stones, and sacrificing Unearthed creatures. So you're still going to get a lot of the main 3 mechanics in those more subtle or narrow archetypes too. So let's start with the big headliner here, Power Stones. It is rare that Wizards Limited designers get the main headliner mechanic wrong, like the big one. It's very often that, it's a thumbs up mechanic. They're just good. Rare that they are traps, and I think they certainly hit here with Power Stones. I think if you had consumed any pre-release content for this set, either through myself or Lords of Limited or pretty much any Limited content creator, you'll be familiar with some of the hype behind these Power Stones. And they're the real deal. For those who don't know, by the way, I should read this out. Power Stones are, they come on cards, often spells will spot you Power Stones. So, for example, we've got Stern Lesson. This is 2 and a blue for an instant, draw 2 cards, then discard a card, make a tap Power Stone token. This Power Stone token is an artifact that has tap, add a colorless mana. This mana can't be spent to cast a non-artifact spells, but of course you can still use it to activate abilities, cast artifact spells, pay for additional costs in some cases. So even though it seems kind of restrictive, there's a lot of applications for them. For Dominaria United, for the set overview, or maybe it was for the State of the Format episode, I mentioned that there wasn't really a thing that I could tell people to draft, and you draft this, you win more. Just like put these cards in your deck, draft them, good stuff's gonna happen. I think that's the opposite here. I think that's not true. I think Power Stones are definitely the type of card that I would just say, mostly anything that says Power Stone on it, hard to go wrong. Some of the cards certainly are going to be better than others, but I think they're all pretty good, and Power Stones just do a lot of good things in your deck. So I think the best way to think about these Power Stones is not necessarily in terms of like how much of a card they're worth, but like just think what they do in your deck. So something like food or blood or treasure, very analogous, where there's these tokens that do something valuable in game, but they're also, and this is the thing I always harp on, they're also just like another game piece, another piece of cardboard. In Magic, if you can just have more material, more resources to work with, that's a good thing. When you cast a card that gives you a Power Stone token, you're going to be up a resource on your opponent. And, how you use that resource is going to depend on what your deck looks like. But, like, in every single deck, there will be a use for it. Sometimes it's casting giant expensive things. Sometimes you're just activating abilities for cheaper. Sometimes, you're sacrificing them. So you can think of Power Stones as ramp tools. And I think when you first look at them, you're like, oh, they're to ramp you to giant things. But that's not their only function, right? So Prototype, which is another mechanic that we're going to get to in a second. There are these kind of split cards that are gigantic artifact creatures, 7, 6, 8 mana cards that you can power out if you have enough Power Stones, but if you don't, you can cast them for cheaper. For example, we have Iron Crusher, which is a 7 mana card that can be cast for cheaper for a Prototype cost of 2 green. They are artifacts, though, so that's the main thing I think when you think of, oh, what am I going to use the Power Stones for? But there's activated abilities all over the place, and also just like trinkety artifacts all over the place. You're going to have a use for these Power Stones somewhere, and sometimes it's just like, I'm up a little bit of tempo on the opponent, right? I can activate my Levitating Statue, which is this 2-mana artifact that has a 2-mana activated ability to become a creature, and it grows when you cast non-creature spells. So like, just something like that, where it's like, well, that 2-mana activation cost, that's offset by Power Stones, and that's just incidental free stuff that you're picking up when you're casting your spells. Also, though, you have ways to use this material. Like I was saying, it's not just what's printed on the card, what the Power Stone does, but the actual state of being an artifact token. You've got something like Pendragon Strongbowl, which is a 3 mana, 2 and a red, 2/3 that you can pay a 1, sack an artifact. The Strongbowl gets +1/+1, and you ping your opponent for 1. So some of the decks are going to be sacrificing the resource just to generate some sort of effect. Another thing, Sentinel Stalwart, which is a 1 mana green creature, 1 mana 1/1, tap an untapped artifact or creature you control, add mana of any color. Power Stone Fracture, 1 and a black sorcery, as initial cost to cast a spell, sacrifice an artifact or a creature, you destroy a creature or a planeswalker. The set's just littered with things, right? The infrastructure of this set is truly designed to be like, if you put Power Stones in your deck, the cards in your deck will synergize with them. So that's just something that frames, I think, most of what the set's about. And let's go to Prototype. So Prototype is, I just touched on this, but kind of a reverse kicker variant. I think when you have not a lot of mana, you can cast it for its Prototype cost. And then when you have a lot of mana, you get to cast your 7, 8, 9 mana card. So for example, I'm going to read out another one here. We've got Combat Thresher. This is 7 mana for an uncommon. It's a 3/3 double strike, and when it enters the battlefield, you draw a card. So 7 mana, 3/3 double strike, draw a card. That's not bad. Remember, you can power this out with Power Stones, and it's got the Prototype cost of 2 and a white for a 1/1, so 3 mana for a 1/1, double strike, draw card, also a very good card. So just think of this as your classic good early, good late mechanic. Kind of helps if you flood a bit, helps if you are also stuck on lands, because it gives you something, a cheap card and an expensive card. I think all of these play out a little bit better than they look. I think some of them just look good, like the Combat Thresher I just read, but even something like Spotter Thopter, which was one when I looked at, I was like, you know what, this is okay. Maybe it's like a fine playable, but I played this quite a bit yesterday during the event, and I saw my opponents play this quite a bit during the event, and I was like, yeah, that's just like pretty good. So Spotter Thopter, 8 mana for a 4/5 flyer. When it ETBs, you scry X, where X is its power, and the Prototype cost is 3 and a blue for a 2/3. Again, you're going to have Power Stones lying around, and it's not even the expensive mode that you're going to use the Power Stones for. Sometimes it's just like, okay, I double spell on turn 6 because I go cast a Spotter Thopter with 3 real mana and a Power Stone, and also a 2-drop, or a 3-drop or something, right? So just, I think one of the ways to think about Power Stones also is just, they help you use more of your mana in a set with a lot of ways to use that Power Stone mana. So just in general, I think if you read a Prototype card, they're just going to be better than you might think. They play out a little bit better, even though they look good. It's kind of funny, before the set came out, I thought, okay, well, you're going to cast the Prototype mode maybe 25%, maybe 75% of the time, the non-Prototype mode, the expensive version, 25% of the time. I found, and again, this is small sample size, I found it was more closer to 50-50. Because there was times when I was like, all right, I'm on 5 mana and I could cast my card, but the game's going in a way where I don't feel pressured to, I have something else to do, and yeah, this is just a really good thing in a turn or two. When I draw an extra land or I have this Power Stone card in my hand, I'll be able to cast it, and it's going to be giant. So don't necessarily count out casting the expensive side of these cards a good amount of the time. I will say, though, unlike Power Stones, Prototype cards do have some misses. They're not all awesome. Even the bad ones, I think, are not bad, terrible, but stuff like Depth Charge Colossus, which is 9 mana, 9/9, It doesn't untap during your untap step, but you can pay 3 to untap it. It's got a prototype cost of 4 blue for a 6/6. Doesn't really work out the way you want, because it's both its modes are expensive. It's kind of anti what I was just talking about, where it's good early, good late. Most of the time, this is just good late. And then you have something like Blitz Automaton, which is a fine card. It's a 3 mana, 3/2 haste, 2 in a red on the prototype side, and then 7 mana, 6/4 haste. Not a terrible card, again, like I said, but definitely a notable difference. Like, the delta between the good Power Stone cards and the bad Power Stone cards is pretty small. I think the delta between the good prototype cards and the bad prototype cards is a bit larger, but for the most part, like 80% of the prototype cards are just pretty good. Unearth. Unearth is the third big mechanic, and this one's kind of a lighter theme, I would say. So Unearth is a cost on creatures, or sometimes non-creatures too, that says you can pay a cost, return this thing to the battlefield, it gains haste, and then you exile it at the end of turn. And you can't really do shenanigans, you can't bring it back to your hand, because no matter what happens to it, it always gets exiled. This is mostly an aggressive mechanic. You want to think of this as an aggro mechanic. Most of the cards with Unearth are red, white, and black, I believe. So that just, kind of points in the direction of, well, these colors are often attacking. And the idea here is you just play your stuff early, maybe you trade off, and then you have a turn where you go, all right, well, my opponent's at 5, and I go Unearth, 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 big attack, right? So it's a good mechanic. It's all mostly upside. Most of the Unearth cards are pretty decent. Another thing you can consider as an Unearth synergy is if you have ways to sacrifice your creatures for cheap, well, a cheap Unearth cost can be pretty good. So for example, you got something like Scrapwork Mutt, which is a 2 mana, 2/1, colorless. When it ETBs, you discard a card and then you draw a card. And it's got Unearth for 2 mana, 1 in a red. And then you got something like Power Stone Fracture, 1 in a black, sorcery. As an additional cast, to cost it, you sack an artifact or a creature, destroy target creature or planeswalker. So, just nice little synergy there. You can bring your Mutt back, do a little bit of filtering, sacrifice your creature after you've attacked an Unearth. One of the things, too, is your opponent isn't often going to want to trade with an Unearth creature, because it's like, okay, well, it's just going to die anyway, so I'll just take some damage. So you have a reasonably large Unearth creature, they're going to be like, well, I'm not going to trade off. So they take some damage, and then you can Power Stone Fracture or whatever you're going to do with it after combat. So nice little synergies. I think less defining than Prototype or Power Stones, just in general. But still, a reasonably important mechanic in the set. Okay, so those are the main mechanics, but a big defining feature of this format is the retro artifact sheet. So I want to talk a little bit about this. This is, in every pack, there is going to be a retro old bordered artifact. And I think if you looked at the set before and didn't consider these, like kind of thought of these as like, like bonus cards you'll like consider and look at sometimes, I think you might have done yourself a bit of a disservice, because these do feel like they have a pretty meaningful impact on the format. Like, some of them are really powerful cards that are just like, wow, that's an awesome card that add more power to every pack. But some of them are structural pieces that might have looked like they were missing. So for example, an example is I think during the set review, I mentioned that blue-red prowess, which is the blue-red archetype, kind of is missing some pieces in the set, because there's not a ton of like cantrippy things. There's no 1 mana like an opt or an impulse. There's not too much of that kind of stuff. But that isn't really true if you're considering the retro artifact sheet, because there's a bunch of stuff like Chromatic Star, Elsewhere Flask, Mishra's Bauble, Soul Guide Lantern, these cheap artifacts that fill that role. Those cards that I just shouted out, I kind of want to highlight these as cards that are a lot better than they look. So I'm going to read out some of these. Chromatic Star, single mana artifact, 1 in tap, sacrifice Chromatic Star, add 1 mana of any color. When it's put into the graveyard, you draw a card, so just cheap mana fixing cantrippy thing. Mishra's Bauble, 0 mana artifact, tap sack it, look at the top card of target player's library, then you draw a card at the beginning of the next turn. Elsewhere Flask, 2 mana artifact, ETB draw a card, sack the flask. All the lands become the land type of your choice until end of turn. Soul Guide Lantern, 1 mana. When it ETBs, you exile a card from a graveyard, tap sack it to exile each opponent's graveyard, and then 1 tap sack to draw a card. So all these cards, and there's a few more that I didn't even mention, kind of play in a very similar space where they do a lot of things glue-like, right? They're very structurally important to a lot of decks. So if you just look at these cards and you break down fundamentally what they're doing, Chromatic Star, for example, or honestly any of the ones I just talked about, it's a cheap artifact, so cards that care about when an artifact enters, well, that's a 1 mana way to trigger those. There's cards that say like, when an artifact enters, you look at the top card of your library, and if it's a land, you put it in your hand. If it's not, you can put it in your graveyard. Just getting a 1 mana trigger on that's pretty good. It's also a sacrifice trigger for cards that care about that. It's also a draw 2 trigger, and there's a mechanic in the set, or there's the blue-black theme is whenever you draw your second card per turn. So they do a lot of really good things, and on top of that, each of these has their own little quirks. So for example, Chromatic Star helps you fix, mana fixing. Elsewhere Flask helps you cast Corrupt, or that cycle of cards that really, there's a cycle of cards that asks you to play a lot of the same land type. For example, Corrupt is 6 mana, 5 and a black. It deals damage equal to the number of swamps you control to target any target. So even if you're not like a mono black deck, you can be like, okay, Flask, sack it, call swamp, hit you for 7. The Soul Guide Lantern is good against the unearthed creatures. So they all have little value on top of the kind of mechanical stuff they do. So all of these cards have been cards I was really happy to, maybe not happy to first pick, but not sad to, and would be pretty happy with them picks 2, 3, 4, 5, around there. So yeah, just to be clear, I just want to restate this. So if you're not familiar with this, there's going to be one in every pack, one of these retro artifacts. They're kind of like the Strixhaven Mystical Archives, if you play with that. They're also divided by rarities too. So you have uncommons, rares, mythics. I think they kind of did us limited players a favor, because some of the mythics that we'll get to in a second are like really, really good and obnoxious. And they said, okay, we don't want these ruining too many limited games. So they did put them at mythic, but we'll get to those in a second. We also have, so we have that class of like trinkety artifacts that I think are pretty high picks. We also have just some generically good cards, stuff like Foundry Inspector, which is 3 mana for an artifact, 3/2 creature. Artifact spells you cast cost 1 less to cast, so just makes all your artifacts cheaper. Phyrexian Revoker, 2 mana for a 2/1 artifact. When it ATBs, you call a non-land card. Activated abilities of that source can't be activated. There's usually something your opponent has that you can snipe off. Note that this does not work with Power Stones, because that is not a card name, that's a token. You can't name tokens. And Sculpting Steel, 3 mana artifact. When ATBs, ETBs as a copy of any artifact from the battlefield, so just a solid card. Then we have kind of like the bomby bombs. So we've got Wormcoil Engine, which is 6 mana, 6/6 Death Touch lifelink. When it dies, you create a 3/3 Death Touch token and a 3/3 lifelink token. Just an absurd card. Altar of Dementia, 2 mana artifact. Sack a creature, target player mills cards equal to that sacrifice creature's power. Really easy to kill your opponent with this, especially with unearthed creatures. 40 cards is not that much. Like, you're going to have 40 power worth of creatures in a lot of games, and you don't even need to do that much because your opponent's drawing a card per turn, plus their opening hand. So the Altar of Dementia is a legit card. Precursor Golem, which is like basically a 5 mana 3/3 that comes with 2 3/3 tokens. Just a really, really good card. So look out for these power cards. Sometimes they're going to be there. These are the higher rarity cards though, so not in every pack. You're not always going to see them. And then we've got some rares that are kind of more build aroundy on this sheet. So you've got stuff like Howling Mine, which is 2 mana for an artifact. At the beginning of each player's draw step, if Howling Mine is untapped, that player draws a card. This is build aroundy both because I think there might be like kind of a Turbo Fog deck going on. There's a Fog at common. There is a uncommon that puts cards from your graveyard on the bottom of your library. So I can see some sort of engine happening there. Also, this is a combo with the Sentinel Druid. I think it's called the 1 mana green creature that taps a artifact or creature to add a mana of any color. Obviously, the combo here is you have the Howling Mine tapped on your opponent's turn and untapped in your turn, so that's kind of cool. Rune Changer's Pike, which is a 2 mana equipment, equip 2, that grows your creatures based on how many spells in your graveyard. Powerful card, but a little bit of a build around. Well of Lost Dreams, which is this like artifact that pays you off for gaining life. So there's some stuff in there that you go like, huh, is that supported? And the answer for most of these cards, like spell payoff and life gain payoff, is no. But the cards exist to make this work. So it's not an already existing archetype in the format, but the commons and uncommons, they have planted some cards. So it's like, oh, actually, this works with that. So, you'll kind of get acquainted with them for the most part as you play the set. But do note that even if a card looks out of place where it's like, oh, I don't have, Well Lost Dreams, life gain's not a supported archetype. There's just enough incidental life gain that if you want to make this card work, and I think it's a good thing to make work, you can make it work. Yeah, so this retro artifact sheet, really, really cool. Really cool addition. If you have not looked at the sheet, I would take a look before going to pre-release, before doing your drafts, because they are older cards that maybe not be as familiar. And they are important parts of the format. Okay, so one thing I want to talk about is land counts. So often in this format, for the drafts I've had so far, and Sam Black, who has proxied this whole set and has played it a bunch of times, he had similar thoughts. I found myself playing 16 or 15 lands more often than 17 or 18 lands. And this is because there are a lot of cards that are cheap in the set that either draw a card when they enter, so these cheap cantripping artifacts that I've been talking about, or they cheaply add mana. So something like Energy Refractor, which is one of the most important common artifacts, 2 mana artifact. When it enters the battlefield, you draw a card, 2 mana. You can add mana, 1 mana of any color. So of course the joke here is you filter your power stones in, and you kind of launder your mana into real mana, quote unquote. But also you can fix. It's a fixing tool. Stuff like Sentinel Stalwart and Springleaf Drum, which are both 1 mana cards that basically have the same effect. Tap the thing and tap an untapped creature or artifact in the Stalwart's case, and you add a mana of any color. And then there's that the cards I was just talking about: Chromatic Star, Elsewhere Flask, Mishra's Bauble. So you have a lot of cards that find lands for cheap or find new cards for cheap. And if you're playing 17 or 18 lands, you tend to flood out a little more often than you would like. If you have, 3 of these kind of trinkety artifacts and a Energy Refractor. So consider going to 15 or 16 lands a bit more often in this set. I guess to give you some guidelines, if you have 2 or 3 of these kind of cards, anything, the cheap artifacts that draw you a card or the cheap mana producers, that's when you can consider shaving a land. I think once you get to like the 5 count, 5, kind of area, in that ballpark, consider shaving 2. But at the same time, I wouldn't shave 2 lands going down to 15 unless you didn't have that much top end. Like if you still have 7 and 8 mana prototype creatures, yeah, that pushes a little more in the direction of closer to 17 or 16 lands. But if your curve is really low, like in a lot of like green-white or red-black decks, I can easily see 15 lands in this set. So definitely don't be completely tied to, your classic priors of just always play 17 lands. That's not always going to be correct here. A cycle I want to talk about, the Mill 3 cycle. So this is a cycle of cards, 1 in each color at common, that basically what they do, they're a little bit different, but they come in, you mill 3 cards, and you can put something from that pile into your hand. So for example, the white one, which is a 3 mana 1/1 flyer, you mill 3, and then from that, among that 3, you can put a plains or a creature mana value 3 or less into your hand. The blue one looks for non-creature, non-lands. The black one looks for creatures. The red one looks for artifacts. The green one looks for lands. And all of this fail case of if you miss or you don't want to take one of those cards, you can put a +1/+1 counter on them. These cards are all pretty good. I think that the blue one and the white one are the best, just because that they have the mostly, the black one too. The black one fits in this category too, but they hit the most often, and the hits are impactful, right? Like you're gonna have a plains or a mana value creature or less creature a lot of the times in your top 3. With the Archaeologist, if you build your deck right, you're gonna have a non-creature, non-land a lot of the time. You're gonna have a creature with the Gigamole a lot of the time. The red one that hits artifacts, I think you miss a decent amount, where if you're artifact heavy, yeah, it's still good, but it's not as good as the others. And the green one's interesting, the Blanchwood Prowler. So this is the 2 mana 1/1. That you mill 3 and you can get a land back or you can put a counter on it. I think this card is bad filler, but good if you are looking to self-mill. Like I think this is one of the, there's a green-black self-mill deck that I think is actually fairly supported. That if you are looking to do that, this is one of the best cards in that deck, or one of the best commons for it. So most of them are just generically good. I like the blue, white, and black ones the best. But I'm a fan of this cycle. They're all pretty good. Artifact and enchantment removal. So, of course, this is an artifact-based set, and the question is, well, are you going to be manning stuff like Disenchant and Shoot Down, which exiles or destroys artifacts and enchantments? And the answer is yeah. I think you can totally play these. If you played Neon Dynasty, I would say this is fairly equivalent to that, where you'd probably want to play, you could play the first 2 comfortably. Once you get to 3, you might run into some diminishing returns, but especially with Disenchant, which is 1 in a white instant, destroy target artifact or enchantment, like that's just a really, really good rate. You can be pretty happy playing that card. I would actually equate Disenchant kind of to Destroy Evil from Dominaria United, where it's going to hit about a third of the creatures in the set, and the creatures it does hit tend to be important, and also it has this buyout of hitting in enchantment some amount of the time, just like Destroy Evil. So I think that value Disenchant about where you would value Destroy Evil, maybe a little bit lower, but around there. Shoot Down is a little clunkier, 3 and a green for a sorcery, exile target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. But yeah, I think you can totally play these cards, and I would aim for 2, but you could play a third if you were missing a playables, for sure. Speed of the format. So this is always a topic that, I think content creators are a little bit reticent to talk about, myself included, because it's kind of like, well, it's really hard to give you a good metric or a good idea of the speed of the format because all decks are going to play out differently. I guess often I think speed of the format is most helpful when a format kind of exists in a space where it's really an outlier, where it's way faster than you might expect or way slower than most sets. And I don't think that Brothers War is either. I think it's like typical Magic's limited set we've seen in the past little while, just like you got to play some stuff on 2, you got to play some stuff on 3. You can fall behind. The board can stall out. I think the most common trajectory for games that I experienced yesterday was you've got to get stuff on the board early. If you don't play, your 2s and 3s, you definitely have the potential to get run over. But the board can also get pretty stalled out. And then once the board gets stalled out, you do want a way to go over the top, either prototype creatures or you have some engine in your deck that you're building towards, just like something big to break through a stall. So it's hard to plan for all of those things, a stalled out board, but also making sure you have a lot of cheap stuff early to not die. So really the deck building advice here and the drafting advice is have a well-rounded deck. I would mostly focus on the early game and the late game, like make sure you have enough early stuff so you're not going to get run over, 4, 5, 6, 7 things to do before turn 3, and also 5-ish things to do in the late game, 6+ mana stuff a lot of the time. Again, power stones, where the board is going to stall out sometimes and you want some way to push through. Yeah, so I mean the cap on this is I do not think that Brothers War is markedly faster or slower than any other set we've had in the past little while. It's just you're going to face fast decks sometimes, and you're going to face slow decks. So, this is why I think it's not super, super helpful to talk about it, but I did think it's worth noting because it is a question that comes up a lot. Another big question that's going to kind of frame the format. How many colors are you playing? This is a question I got a lot yesterday. Do the monocolored decks exist? There's kind of whispers of that going on. I think this is, by and large, a 2-color format. You're most likely, 70% of the time, going to be a 2-color deck. But there is the cycle of cards that I mentioned earlier that reward you for playing monocolored. So we've got Lay Down Arms, which is a single white mana sorcery. Exile target creature mana value less than or equal to the number of planes you control. Its controller gains 3 life. Flow of Knowledge, 5 mana, instant, draw a card for each island you control, then discard 2 cards. Corrupt, which I think is the best one of the bunch. 6 mana, 5 and a black, sorcery. Corrupt deals damage equal to target. Any target equal to the number of swamps you control, and you gain life equal to this way. Seradian Cliff Stomper, 1 in a red for an 0/4. As long as it's your turn and you control 4 or more mountains, Seradian Cliff Stomper gets +X+0, where X is the number of mountains you control. So it's like an 0/4 for 2, but it's a 4/4 for 2 if you have 4 mountains. And then Blanchwood Armor, 2 in a red for an enchantment, an aura. Enchanted creature gets +1/+1 for each forest you control. And these are all uncommon, by the way. I think that Corrupt is awesome. I think that Blanchwood Armor is pretty good too. I think there is a pretty decent mono green aggro deck. The other ones I am less impressed with. Oh, sorry, Cliff Stomper's okay too in mono red, like a actual mono red deck. The white one and the blue one, I'm not super fans of. Like Lay Down Arms, you have to put a lot of planes in your deck, and I think, spoiler alert, I don't think white is the strongest color. I think it's the weakest color, and so like all planes does not sound like an awesome thing to do. And your payoff here is like a pretty decent removal spell, but not even like insanely good. And then Flow of Knowledge, I think, is a okay card draw spell, but like you can get your card advantage other ways. You don't have to be monocolored just to get a good card advantage spell. So Corrupt is awesome. I would consider drafting a mono black deck if you have multiple Corrupts, or just a Corrupt in black is really open. Blanchwood Armor, same with that. And Cliff Stopper, same with that too. Is this going to happen every draft? Of course not. Is this going to be a 1 in every 10 draft kind of thing? I think that's probably a little more accurate. But also, I don't think you're restricted to 2 colors or 1 color. My first draft of the format was a pretty colorful deck. It was green-red splashing both black and blue. Black for Mishra, claimed by Gix, which is a mythic. Skyfisher Spider, which is a green-black uncommon, and Surge Engine, which is a blue mythic. And it was really successful. I think some of the conversation early in the set release or in the preview season was that there aren't a lot of fixing tools. And just like I was saying, if you didn't look at the retro artifact sheet, I think that looks true. But if you add Chromatic Star and a few other things in there, well, you've got Chromatic Star, Energy Refactor, which is the kind of prophetic prison variant. Evolving Wilds exist. You've got Sentinel Stalwart, which is the green mana dork. So there's like a decent number of ways to just generate any color of mana, or, a splash source if you'd like. It's possible. You can definitely, it's in the spectrum. So I guess what I would say is it's like 70% 2 color decks, then maybe like 20% 2 color and a splash, or 2 color and 2 splashes, and then some 10% monocolored decks. And that monocolored estimate might even be overshooting a little bit, because aside from that cycle of monocolored payoffs, I think it's pretty low cost just to play a second color. You're not really getting that much from playing a monocolored deck. I think a lot of times people are very, romanticize the idea of a monocolored deck in Limited, but the truth is, it's not that much of a cost to play a few good cards in another color, and you probably should just like splash a few removal spells if you have access to that. the consistency of monocolor is nice, but you're always laying power versus consistency unlimited. And yes, the consistency is good, but the power you get from splashing, just a few other good cards of another color does outweigh that, I believe. Okay, so I'm going to touch on the archetypes just quickly. I'm not going to do a deep dive. I just want to touch on some preliminary thoughts. But I think maybe next week when we do the state of the format address, we'll dive a little bit deeper into this. One thing I want to say about the 2-color pairs is that all of the gold cards are kind of bangers. Like, they're all, maybe with the exceptions like 1 or 2, they're all really good, really pushed and powerful cards. And I would not be too sad, and I did this multiple times yesterday, just like take a third path Iconoclast, which is red, blue, 2/1 uncommon. Whenever you cast a non-creature spell, you make a 1/1 artifact token creature. Or Evangel of Synthesis, blue, black, for a 2/3. When it ETBs, you draw a card, discard a card, and as long as you've drawn your second card per turn, Evangel gets +1/+0 and gains menace. Like, all these cards, if you just go down the list, are like, wow, that's really, really quite good. Sometimes gold cards miss. Sometimes it's like, oh yeah, that's the theme, but that card's just not very good. And I think for the most part, they're all pretty good, and I would not be upset about first pitching a Yoshin Tactician, which is 2 white blue for a 3/4. Other soldiers you control get +1/+1, and just building around that. So of note, just like if the gold card reads pretty good, and all of them I think do, take them, and I think they're good splashes in some cases, but also good lead-ins to drafting that deck. So I will call out some of them that I think are outliers on both ends of the spectrum, like not so good and so good that they're splashable. So the really, really good ones, Skyfisher Spider. I think this might be the best one of the bunch. If not, it's up there. 2 black-green for a 3/3 reach. When it ETBs, you can sacrifice another creature. When you do, destroy target non-land permanent, and then when it dies, you may gain a life for each creature in your graveyard if you do exile the spider. Really, really good. Versatile. You don't have to exile it. You could buy it back, redo it. I could certainly see you splashing this in like a blue-green deck or something. Junkyard Genius is another one that I think is exactly what this deck wants to do. This is 1 black-red for a 2/2. When it ETBs, you make a Power Stone, which is just, good on its own. Then 1 black-red sack a creature or an artifact. Until in a turn, other creatures you control get +1/+0 and gain menace and haste. So really, really powerful. I think on the lower end of the spectrum are Philagi Vanguard, which is 2 red-white for a 2/3 first strike. Whenever it or another creature enters the battlefield, target creature you control gets +2/+0 until end of turn. It's an okay card. It's fine, but it's not like, stand out, want to splash it, gonna define an archetype. And I think that's the one. Or another one that's like, it's good, but it doesn't define an archetype is Arbalest Engineers. This is 1 red-green for a 2/2. When it ETBs, you make a Power Stone, or you can ping something, or you can give it +1/+1 and haste and trample until end of turn. Or sorry, any creature, not just this one. So it's a really good card, but it doesn't really push towards any direction. I will also take a moment here to just talk about all these archetypes in general. So the ones that I've been impressed with, white-blue soldiers, from what I played against, really, really impressed with. I think this is the best white archetype early on. There is a lot of soldiers littering the set, so if you have the payoffs, which there isn't too many, but the payoffs are good, if you have the payoffs, it's not very hard to just have a good deck because there are soldiers running around in both blue and white in excess. So you don't have to work hard to make this card work. Junkyard Genius, which I mentioned, the 1 black-red creature that makes a Power Stone. It plays with the sacrifice synergies. I think that red-black as a deck is really well supported. There's a lot of good sacrifice outlets, free sacrifice outlets. There's an Active Treason a common that generates a Power Stone, which is really good. I really like Third Path Iconoclast, which is the red-blue one that makes 1/1 tokens when you cast a non-creature. I really like Hero of the Dunes, which is white-black 3/2. When ETBs, you reanimate a artifact or creature card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard, and creatures you control with mana value 3 or less get +1/+0. Those were the standouts to me. I heard Sam Black talking about a kind of green-white artifact fall deck with Yoshin Dissident, which is green-white 1/1. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. So you've got all really, really cheap cards. You can build around that. I haven't experienced that myself, but just outsourcing some knowledge here. So yeah, in general, I think these cards are great, and I think you can take them early. And to close it out here, I want to talk about the commons. I'm calling this the part with the commons. Very broad, but I think that, so a lot of times when I do this for other set overviews, I pick out some of the kind of contenders for top commons. And I'm going to do that a little bit here, but I mostly just want to be talking about my experience with some of these cards more than oh, this card is awesome, this card is bad. I mean, I'm going to talk about a little bit of that. But I think for the most part, the commons in this set are fairly flat in power level, which means there's not giant power level outliers, which might be good news for a lot of people. Like, there's no Organ Hoarder. I don't think there's an uncommon also that is like Wingmantle Chaplain or just like Busted Good or Zenith Flare. So I think this set is constructed a lot of like pretty good cards that you can maximize on in the right decks. And I think it is a disservice to be like common 1, common 2, common 3, at least this early in the format. Like, yes, as the format progresses, that picture is going to become a little more clear, but I mostly just want to talk about some cards as we go through these colors. Okay, so let's start with white. Like I mentioned a little bit before, I think white is a bit of the redheaded stepchild when it comes to the colors. I think that its themes are there. It's playing with like cheap creatures, mana value 3 or less, has soldiers. The soldier stuff I think is real. The mana value 3 or less stuff, a little bit less, just because I think it's kind of asks you to like play in more of a grindy space. A lot of the cards that care about mana value 3 or less like reanimate them, and that's fine. It's all fine and good. But I think like the two main themes, mana value 3 or less, like getting value from those, and soldiers, they're not completely dissident with each other, but soldiers definitely want you to attack, and the other theme wants you to grind a little bit more. So there's a little bit of tension there. I also think that there are just fewer generically good white commons than there are for the other colors. So I'm going to touch on the ones I do like. I think Airlift Chaplain, 2 and a white for a 1/1 flyer. What you mill 3, this is the white card in the mill 3 cycle. You put a plains or a creature card from among those 3 into your hand. If not, you put a counter on it. Generically pretty good. I was impressed with this card. I felt pretty good casting it. Scrapwork Cohort, which if you're watching, the power and toughness on this card is wrong. It should be a 3/1. 4 mana 3/1 for an artifact creature. When it ETBs, you make a 1/1 token, soldier, and it has Unearth for 2 and a white. So just pretty good stats all around. Makes 2 artifacts, can make 4 artifacts altogether. Aeronaut Cavalry is one that I think I underrated a little bit in the set review, but I was impressed with. 4 and a white for a human soldier. 3/4 flyer. When ETBs, you put a counter on another target soldier. So enables an attack and then is a pretty decent body on itself. And then Lauren's Escape. I like this one too. Single white mana for an instant target artifact or creature. Gains hexproof and indestructible until on a turn. You scry 1. Just good protection effect. Kind of Tameo safekeeping-esque, but instead of 2 life, you trade that in for scry. So a solid card just in general. The 2 drops in white are fine, passable. I think that the soldier deck is going to want Phalanx Vanguard, and the 3 mana value grindy deck is going to want Power Stone Engineer. So Phalanx Vanguard is 1 and a white for a soldier, 2/2 vigilance. Whenever an artifact enters the battlefield under your control, the Vanguard gets +1/+0 until on a turn. You can see how that kind of plays nice with the card I was just talking about, the Scrapwork Cohort, that makes 2 artifacts when it comes in. Power Stone Engineer is 1 and a white for a 2/1. When it dies, you create a tap Power Stone token. Again, might be ramping in your white deck sometimes when you got expensive artifacts, but sometimes just like you're sacrificing it for value in black-white or something like that. So just a decent card, generates value on death. Your opponent sometimes, he's kind of reticent to trade off with it. So solid 2 drops, but I think unlike some of the 2 drops of previous sets, these are not cards to write home about, I would say. Then we got a card that I am not 100% sure on either way. Warlord's Elite. So this is 2 and a white for a 4/4. Okay, so obviously that is sounds a little bit too good to be true, and it is. It's a soldier, which is good. As an additional cost to cast this spell, you tap 2 untapped artifacts, creatures, and or lands you control. So I think that the idea with this card, ideally, you have a really, really low to the ground deck, like all 1s and 2s, and you can power out multiple of these early and you just dump your hand, kind of like Convoke style. I think if you're not doing that, this is a bad card. I think if you are doing that, it's a solid but not awesome card, because it can still be awkward. Tapping your creatures that you want to attack with to play something else is not always the best thing to be doing. Jury is out on this one. I am optimistic, but also skeptical about it. Whenever my opponent cast this card, I was not super sad about it. I was like, all right, you just tapped your creature, and I was worried about that thing attacking me. You played a 4/4. That gives me a bit of breathing room to untap and either kill it or play something else. So, like I said, keeping my eye on this one. I don't have a firm belief one way or the other, but I do think that there is a place for this if your deck is that super low to the ground deck. And then 2 interaction spells. Prison Sentence, 2 and a white for an enchantment aura. When it ETBs, you enchant creature, and when it ETBs, you scry 2. The enchanted creature can't attack or block or activate its abilities. This is a card that strikes me as poorly positioned in this set because people are main decking stuff like Disenchant and the green Exile and Enchantment. Also, there's a sacrifice theme. I think that the Scry 2 on Enter the Battlefield does make up for that a decent amount. Just, getting filtering you early or later in the game, kind of getting lands out of the way. It's kind of like almost like draw a card later in the game. So I guess my early take on this is it is fine to put it in your deck. It's not, you don't feel embarrassed to do it, but you also shouldn't load up on it because there are some decks that just really, really punish you for it. Like decks with sacrifice themes or, for example, if you play this and your opponent has the card, the 2 mana sack something to destroy a creature, you just feel really, really bad about that. So an okay card, I wouldn't prioritize it too early, but it is also a card that you can just put in your deck. Disenchants, main deckable. Like I touched on this already, so I won't talk about it too much. But again, this is just 1 and a white. Instant destroy target artifact or enchantment. All right, moving on to blue. So blue's got quite a few cards I like. The 2 cards that I am fairly confident are the best, and I'm not sure which one it is, but I have a bet on one of them. The 2 cards are Stern Lesson, which is 2 and a blue for an instant. Draw 2 cards, then discard a card, make a Power Stone token. Again, all the things, nice things I said about Power Stone tokens apply here, but it also just like helps you dig through your deck, plays well with other instant speed stuff, puts unearthed cards in the graveyard, and honestly, if you have the right deck for this next card here, it's my take for potentially best common or has the highest ceiling as a common in the set. And this is Mightstone Animation. 3 and a blue for an aura. Enchant artifact. When Mightstone Animation enters the battlefield, you draw a card. And enchanted artifact is a creature with base power and toughness 4/4 in addition to its other types. So the play patterns with this are just you cast a card on turn 3 that makes a Power Stone. Turn 4, you've got a hasty 4/4 that draws a card. That's really, really good, obviously. You could also just put it on like a trinkety artifact creature you played early. You have to have enough artifacts in your deck, but that's not that hard. I did find this a little bit awkward in multiples, because like sometimes you have a little bit of a problem both casting multiple 4-mana cards, but also finding artifacts to put this on. But I think just like any game where I play this on 4 and I got an attack and drew a card, I just felt massively ahead. Or sometimes you just block with it, right? Like it just... it's in the right deck. It's just 4 mana, 4/4 draw a card straight up, right? And that's just really powerful. I don't think it's too much of a build around just because most decks are going to have artifacts lying around. So jury's still out, but my money is on Mightstone Animation as best blue common. And then a few other ones for blue here that I've liked. The Fajali Archaeologist, this is the blue one in the mill cycle, 1 in a blue 0/3 that you mill 3 cards. If you can take a non-creature, non-land card from among them, put into your hand. If you don't, but you put a counter on it. Weak Stone Subjugation, which is a single blue mana for an aura. You enchant an artifact or creature. That permanent doesn't untap during its controller's untap step, and you can pay 3 as this enters to tap the enchanted permanent. Nice too that the 3 is an additional cost, not part of actually casting the spell. So you can't use Power Stones for that. So that's kind of cool. Got all of these same issues as Prison Sentence does that I was mentioning. Bad against Sacrifice, bad against Disenchants. But at least this one's really cheap. A lot of times I just went like, all right, 1 mana, lock that down, play a 3-drop. So I'm a fan of this. Scatter Ray is an interesting one. 1 in a blue for an instant. Counter target artifact or creature spell unless its controller pays 4. So this is pretty close to Essence Scatter, just straight up counter target creature. I did find there were spots in my games yesterday where it was awkward because my opponent on turn 5, 6, 7 had a lot of Power Stones lying around and they could pay for the additional cost pretty easily. So I don't think this is as good as Essence Scatter was in Dominaria United, but I still think it's a solid card. I think you can totally play a copy or 2 in your deck. Where the contrast was that, Essence Scatter, I was happy playing like 5 of them. Basically, I think that Essence Scatter didn't have many diminishing returns, where I think that card does. And then just quickly, I want to touch on Desynchronize, which is 5 mana, 4 in a blue for an instant. Target non-land permanent's owner puts it on top or bottom of their library. You scry 2. I was fine with this card, kind of just catch-all, a little bit clunky, but the scry 2 does make up for that quite a bit by just being able to like filter through your deck. Just like we learned with Imperial Oath, scry 2 and scry 3 on 5 and 6 mana is really powerful because it's close to draw a card at that point. And I was perfectly fine playing this card. All right, black here. Okay, settle in for a bit of a long haul because black has a lot of cards that are worth talking about. None of them are, holy crap, best common for sure. But they all are pretty good in general. So let's just go through them. I don't even feel very comfortable ranking them like top 3 or anything. So Ravenous Gigamole, which is the black creature in the mill cycle that I've been talking about. 4 mana 3/2, or sorry, 4 mana 2/3, mills 3 when it enters. You can put a creature card from among them into your hand if you don't put a +1/+1 counter on them. You know, if you have 15, 16 creatures in your deck, pretty likely to hit. If this is just 4 mana, 2/3, draw a card, that's a solid card. Emergency Weld, 1 in a black for a sorcery. Return target artifact or creature from your graveyard to your hand. Create a 1/1 colorless soldier artifact token. Kind of like a little Gravedigger. Plays well with sacrifice synergies because you can have this 1/1 in sacrifice. I will note that I am lower on this card than I was before playing the set. Or after playing the set, I should say. I had a deck where I had multiples, I think 2 or 3. And they did clog up my hand a little more than I would have liked. So I think this is a card that is powerful in small numbers, but does definitely have some diminishing returns. It's a good rate, raise dead plus make a 1/1, but you don't want to load up too much on this. It's more of a 1 to 2 copy kind of thing. Scrapwork Rager, 4 mana artifact, 2/2. When ETBs, you draw a card, lose a life. Kind of just an artifact version of Phyrexian Rager, and it has Unearth for 3 in a black. Just a solid card, good value, good to sacrifice. Moment of Defiance. This is one that surprised a lot of people when I was playing multiple copies on the stream yesterday. So this is 2 in a black for a instant. Target creature gets +2/+1 and gains lifelink until end of turn, draw a card. So it's pretty close to Suit Up, Majestic Metamorphosis, these type of cards that we've seen, these combat tricks that give a power boost, give an ability, draw a card. And yes, this is different from those cards, from Suit Up and from Majestic Metamorphosis, but I don't think it's worse, and it could be better. Do not underestimate Lifelink. Lifelink is huge. It gives a smaller power bonus, so yes, you're not always going to win the combat, but sometimes you do. Sometimes they just line up a 3/3 and you're 3/3. You cast this, you gain 5, you draw a card. That's a really big swing. And it's also just really good in the mid game too. Trading in a dorky creature, gaining 4 life, drawing a card, cashing it in. It's got a lot of good applications. It swings race. Some games, your opponent's like, if they have the Moment of Defiance, we're racing here, I just can never win, right? You've also got giant creatures in this set, and Lifelink plays really well with giant creatures. You swing in with your 6/6 or whatever, you give that +2/+1 Lifelink. That's a big swing too. So this is a card, don't overlook it. It also plays well with the blue-black draw 2 synergies. Blue-black, I should have mentioned this when we were talking about it before, but blue-black has kind of a tempo-y aggressive bent to it. It's not really a control deck, and this card plays well. You're attacking, you draw your extra card, you trigger all your payoffs that care about drawing cards. So yeah, do not discount this card, it's quite good. Gix's Caress, this is 2 in a black for a sorcery. Target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it, that player discards it, and you make a Power Stone token. So the card that a lot of people have been equating this to is Toll of Invasion, for those who played War of the Spark, which was this card, but instead of making a Power Stone, you made a 1/1 token, a mass token. And I think this card is a little bit worse than that card. It's still pretty good though. So this just falls into the camp of, yes, you're making a resource, you're using a card to get a card from your opponent. There are going to be some games that's a little bit awkward where your opponent like casts a 2, casts a 3, you have this on turn 3, and you're like, well, I don't really want to cast this because I have to affect the board, and the Power Stone on turn 4 isn't actually going to ramp me at all, and maybe I'm a black deck that isn't even casting expensive things, and the Power Stone is more there just to generate a resource to sacrifice later. So it's a good card. I don't think you can just load up on them, but I think you're going to be pretty happy just playing 1 or 2 of these in your main deck, in your decks that have some sacrifice outlets, some ways to use the Power Stones, or just expensive stuff, for sure. Few more cards. I think I have 2 more slides here. Trench Stalker. 5 mana, 5 in a black for a 4/5. As long as you've drawn 2 cards this turn, 2 or more, sorry, Trench Stalker has Death Touch and Lifelink. Huge overperformer. I was really impressed with this on my side and my opponent's side. So much of the time, if you're building your deck right, and it's not that hard to draw your second card per turn. Like I said, there's a lot of cantrippy artifacts, a lot of things just happen to draw a card incidentally. This is just 5 mana, 4/5, Death Touch, Lifelink. And that is really difficult to block, and sometimes your opponent just goes, I gotta suck that up because that's lifelink and I can't race that. So it's a really nice combo, right? Because your opponents are always incentivized to block lifelinkers because they can't just let those survive. They can't ever win a race if those stick around. But Death Touch also just means it's a real pain to block. So yes, it's 5 mana, but I do think it's a really good 5 mana card. Gixian Skullflayer is another one here. 2 in a black for a 2/3. At the beginning of your upkeep, if there are 3 or more creature cards in your graveyard, you put a +1/+1 counter on Gixian Skullflayer. A card I underrated before seeing it in play. I assumed this would be like, all right, by the time this is on, it's maybe turn 6, and it's like a little bit too slow. I had opponents yesterday where they really leaned into the green-black self-mill stuff. this was on turn 3. And that's not average. It's not your average scenario. But they had the 2-mana mill 3 cards, and then I traded off with that. And then this came down, and I was like, oh crap, that's just going to get out of hand really, really quickly. And I think you can turn this on turn 4, on turn 5. And that's just not too bad. So a card that's a bit of a synergy piece. Certainly, if you're putting this card in your deck, I think you need ways to get cards into your graveyard, the self-mill. But it is a good reward for doing that. Goring Warplow, just one I want to call out here. 6-mana prototype card. 5/4 Death Touch, prototype, 1 in a black for a 1/1 Death Touch. Just solid. Yeah, just good, solid, playable. You can play it. It looks a little bit unexciting, but it's an artifact. Your black deck wants to trade early, buy it back with Emergency Weld. All good stuff. All right, and we've got this package here of sacrifice synergy cards. So we've got Thraxodemon, 1 in a black for a 2/2. 3-mana tap it, sacrifice a creature or an artifact, draw a card. Killzone Acrobat, 2 in a black for a 3/2. Whenever it attacks, you can sacrifice a creature or an artifact. If you do, the Killzone Acrobat gains flying. Gixian Infiltrator, 1 in a black for a 2/1. Whenever you sacrifice another permanent, put a +1/+1 counter on the Infiltrator. The value of these cards is really going to depend on what your deck's doing. I had some decks yesterday that I was like, okay, I have a black deck that has a few sacrifice things going on here. Maybe these cards are pretty good. And they did underperform. But if your deck is, for example, red-black, really synergistic, these cards are a good engine. Like, Infiltrator is just going to keep growing. Thraxodemon's there to get the engines going, filter through some cards. And Killzone Acrobat, I should shout out as a card worth noting because it is a 0-mana sacrifice outlet. So that's important for Sibling Rivalry. Sibling Rivalry is a 4-mana red card that we're going to get to. It's an act of treason. Steal your opponent's thing until end of turn. You make a Power Stone. So on turn 4, you can steal their thing. That it doesn't get an attack because this has to sacrifice it before combat, but 4-mana removal spell with a free sacrifice outlet. So just worth noting. Then I want to talk about, I said we had 2 slides here. We got another one. A suite of removal spells. So really kind of interesting because all of these removal spells that I have here, there's 3 at common. They actually pretty dramatically shifted in my evaluation after playing the set. The best one, I believe, is Power Stone Fracture. So this is 1 in a black for a sorcery. As an initial cost, I've read this a million times, but just for posterity's sake here. As an initial cost to cast it, you sack an artifact or creature, destroy target artifact, or destroy target creature or planeswalker. This card, I think, looks like a Bone Splinters, which, if you look at DMU, that card is not particularly good. There's some sets where Bone Splinters is good, some sets where it isn't. I think this is a really good set for Bone Splinters. Not only is there, Power Stones you can sacrifice, but there's also just a bunch of trinkety stuff that you don't mind sacrificing. My opponents had some really, really good tempo turns with this card. Just casting 2 of them sometimes. Sacrificing their emergency weld token to this. Killing my biggest thing. Getting in. Playing a 3-drop. Really impressed by this card. It turns on earlier than you might think. Just because there are things you don't mind sacrificing. So I do think you have to consider this in the deck build a little bit. But I was really pleasantly surprised. Then the card that I was a lot lower on after playing with it is Overwhelming Remorse. So this is 4 in a black for an instant. Cost 1 less for each creature in your graveyard. Exile target creature or planeswalker. I think this card is still fine, but I don't think this is like premium black removal spell that you're just going to take early. I think if you are self-milling, the card is actively excellent, but you do want to have some of that stuff going on. I had this in a blue-black deck without a lot of self-mill, without a lot of sacrifice, where it was consistently 5 mana. I had evasive creatures, so they weren't trading, and this was just too clunky a little bit too much of the time. So, powerful card, has a high ceiling, not just your Extinguish the Light variant where it's just like, this is just a good card. I would be a little bit lower on it in the draft than you normally are on these like catch-all black removal spells. And then the kind of middle of the road child here, we've got Disfigure, single black mana for an instant. Target creature gets -2 until end of turn. Sorry, -2 until end of turn, which is of course relevant because you can do that in combat, so it's not just kind of like a shock. You can get a little more value out of that. It was fine. I played 2 copies of it in one of my decks, and I was like, yeah, this kill a cheap creature, then want to combat later. Can be a little bit awkward, diminishing returns, certainly, but, it was a card I was perfectly happy to play. So I think all of these black removal spells either have diminishing returns or have a bit of a deck building cost. You just have to consider them. None of them are awesome. None of them are terrible. You do have to consider that as you're building your deck, though. All right, red. Red has, as kind of red often does, like one really good interaction spell, and then some pretty decent aggressive cards littering the file. Like, it's not, oh man, like red stacked. It's just, okay, here's some cards I want to talk about. So, Excavation Explosion, 2 in a red for a sorcery. It deals 3 to anything, including your opponent's face. You make a tap Power Stone token. I think that just sounds good. It played well. Kill your opponent's 3-drop. You set yourself up for a good turn 4, where you have a little more mana. Goes to face. I killed my opponent with this multiple times yesterday, so I think this is just the best generically good card early on in the draft. I've also splashed this card already. Pendragon Strongbull. So I mentioned this one before, but this is 2 in a red for a 2/3. 1 sack an artifact. The Strongbull gets +1/+1 until end of turn, and it deals 1 damage to each opponent. So it's really difficult to block. And also, when you draw this late and you've got some fodder lying around, your opponent just dies to it a lot of the time. Like, it's a 3-drop that's good on turn 3, hard to block, and also good on turn 7 or 8, because your opponent often has to be like, well, I gotta kill that or else it's just gonna kill me eventually. So not exactly sure where you're gonna take this card. Maybe it's more of a sacrifice synergy card. At the same time, kind of just like Power Stone Fracture, the black removal spell, I think there's enough trinkety stuff going on that you don't have to work too hard for this card to be good. Unleash Shell. This is one I want to mention as probably a little bit better than it reads if you're used to 5 mana red removal. So this is 3 red for an instant. Unleash Shell deals 5 damage to target creature or planeswalker and 2 damage to that permanent's controller. Just good, right? 5 mana, kill a thing, 2 damage to the face. It's a little bit clunky, diminishing return certainly, but I was a fan of it. And then the red card I was talking about earlier, Sibling Rivalry. This is 3 in a red for a sorcery. Gain control of target artifact or creature until end of turn. You untap it, it gains haste, you make a Power Stone token. Obviously great in red-black sacrifice. I think you can just throw this in some of your red decks and be happy with it though. Like, I think the fail case of take your opponent's thing for the turn, get in a big hit, make a Power Stone token, especially in a set where people are casting monstrous, gigantic, flying and trampling 7/7s and stuff. This card just does have a place in your red aggressive deck. So a bit of a synergy card, but I don't think you should feel too bad about main decking it. Raise the Ground is another one that I think, I didn't mention this when talking about the artifact and enchantment removal, but kind of falls in the same camp. 2 in a red, sorcery. The spell can't be countered. Destroy target artifact. If it was a mana value 1 or less, you draw a card. So you could kill a Power Stone. You could kill a token with this. Just fine. Yeah, just totally serviceable. Perfectly fine playable. And then 2 artifacts here I want to call out. Scrapwork Mutt. Talked about this one a little bit before. 2 mana artifact, 2/1. ETBs, discard a card, draw a card. Unearth, 1 in red. Solid card. Just enable some synergies. Good 2-drop. Comes back later. Attacks later. You can pitch it for value. Never going to be too sad about it. Mishra's Juggernaut is kind of an interesting one. I don't exactly know where this falls. This is 5 mana for a 5/3 artifact with trample. Attacks each turn if able. Unearth, 5 in a red. This card was really, really good when you can play it on turn 4 after a Power Stone, and just kind of medium when you can't. Like when I played it on turn 5, I mean, my opponent had to deal with it. It's a trampling creature. It comes back for a big hit on an Earth. But I think this is really, the value of this card is really going to depend on how many Power Stones you have at 3 mana. Power this out early, great. If you can't, yeah, it gets a little more mediocre. All right, and then green. Green has got a few pretty good ones. So this is Argothian Opportunist, I believe is the best green common. This is 2 and a green for a 3/2. When ETBs, make a tap Power Stone token. So very similar to a lot of cards that we've already seen, but just a good card. Epic Confrontation, a good fight spell, 1 in a green sorcery. Target creature you control gets +1/+2 until end of turn. It fights target creature you don't control. One of the biggest overperformers from yesterday was Argothian Sprite. So this is 1 in a green for a 2/2 fairy. Can't be blocked by artifact creatures. So again, it's about a third of the creatures in the set. 7 mana, put 2 +1/+1 counters on Argothian Sprite. So pretty decent threat early. Can't be blocked by a lot of things, and it just scales. And again, 7 mana might look like a lot, but Power Stones make that a lot more tenable. A few more cards here. Gaia's Gift. 2 mana for a trick, 1 in a green instant. Put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Gains reach, trample, hexproof, indestructible until end turn. It's a lot of keyword abilities. Pretty efficient. Saves your creature in a lot of combats. Tramples over. Is a protection spell. Just a card I think you're going to be happy in a lot of your green decks. I should also say, I mentioned this before, but green is doing 2 things. It is either ramping with Power Stones to cast these gigantic monstrosities, or it is aggressive. I think there is a pretty decent green aggressive shell with just there's a 2 mana 3/1 ward 2. There's Gaia's Gift here for protection. There's Giant Growth in the set. There's Gothian Sprite as another good aggressive creature. So look for those shells when you're kind of evaluating these green cards. I'm not sure the balance of how often the Power Stone deck comes together versus how often the green aggro deck comes together, but I did have a good mono green deck yesterday that didn't do so well because my opponent's decks were also very, very good, but it felt pretty powerful to me. Just going like, have my Blanchwood armor, giving my creature +5/+5, Gaia's Gift to trample over for a bunch. So just keep that in mind. Then we have Boulder Branch Golem, 7 mana artifact creature, 6/5. When it ETBs, you gain life equal to its power, and then prototype 3 green for a 3/3. It's kind of not even a green card because I think a lot of the rampy Power Stone decks that aren't green, maybe like a blue base deck, is just going to want to play this card. Just 7 mana artifact that comes down on 6 a lot of the time. Gain 6/5. That's a lot of life. So this is just a solid card. I wouldn't even really look at it as a green card though. It's just going to be a card you're going to want in a lot of your decks. Then 2 last green cards here that are more deck specific but can be powerful. Citadel Stalwart is the mana dork I talked about, where you have to tap an artifact or a creature you control to add a mana. Good with a lot of cheap cards and good with Power Stones. So if you have Power Stones or you have a lot of 2s, a lot of 1s, this is where this card shines. If you don't have those things, it's not particularly good. And then Blanchwood Prowler, I also mentioned this one, the 2 mana 1/1 that mills 3. You can take a land from those 3. If not, you put a +1/+1 counter on it. Very good. Like, I think this is the best enabler if you are looking to enable the graveyard stuff. If you're not looking to enable any graveyard stuff, I think this card is just medium. Last thing I want to get to before we talk to chat here for some chat Q&A. Just want to point out 2 pretty good artifacts. This is an artifact set, so I'm talking about some colorless cards as well as the top cards in each color. Energy Refractor, talked about this one before. 2 mana, when it ETBs, you draw a card. 2 mana to add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. And this is just mostly a card that I'm interested in for having a cheap artifact that comes in and draws a card. I think that is most of the value for this card, to trigger all your stuff that cares about that. But, once in a while, this is valuable for ramping you with your Power Stones into a quote-unquote real card. A 7-drop that needs real mana to cast, not Power Stone mana, or filtering you, fixing you, also does that role. And then Stone Retrieval Unit. This is an interesting one. 4 mana for a 2/3. When it ETBs, you make a Power Stone token. So it's not as good as the 3 mana things that make a Power Stone token, obviously, but I've been pretty happy with it. It's just a card that gives you 2 artifacts, and your cards that care about when an artifact's entering really appreciate that. And I think it is definitely worse than the 3 mana cards that make Power Stones, but I think if you're looking to ramp to 6, 7, 8 mana stuff, it's not that much worse. So keep your eye out for that. All right, and that is all from my end, chat. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. Twitch chat, if you got any questions, any clarifications you'd like me to make, feel free. And we'll send it to Twitch chat here. All right, first question here. In decks where you're going down to 15 lands, how much do you need to watch your double colored spells? Is it workable to have BB or RR 4-drops in a 15 lander, or is that asking for trouble? So it's always going to be a bit of a balance, right? Like when you have double pipped cards or your mana costs are a bit trickier, that pushes you towards more lands. If your mana costs are easier, you're monocolored, that pushes you towards fewer lands. So there's not like a clear answer I could give you. I guess it is, yes, going down a land when you have multiple double pipped cards is going to be a problem. But I think that issue kind of self-solves itself a lot of the time, because the cards that you're going down lands for help you with your mana so much of the time. They're the Green Druid, they're Chromatic Star, Elsewhere Flask, the Refractor. So I would actually say more often than not, the concession you're going to that you're going to follow through on is this deck wants fewer lands, even though I do have some tough cards to cast, because the cards that make me want fewer lands help me cast my cards. Any thoughts on the mill strategy? Didn't hear it mentioned, though. There's a few cards that support it. So I'm assuming you mean opponent mill, not self mill. Yes, there are a few cards that support it on the artifact sheet. Mostly those cards, though. Okay, so I think off the top of my head, it's Millstone, Keening Stone, and Mesmeric Orb. Millstone is just too slow. I don't think you should play that card. Mesmeric Orb, which is a 2 mana artifact at Mythic that whenever a permanent untaps, that player mills a card. I think that card is very difficult to make work, because unless you have other mill cards in your deck, it's extremely hard to break the parity on that, because often when you have a mill deck, you're really like a control deck with mill as your finisher. And if you're a control deck, you're going to be tapping your mana as frequently as your opponent, if not more. So yes, you can like sneak out a win with that card sometimes. I don't think it's a reliable thing to do without other mill cards. The one mill card I think is good is Keening Stone, which is a 6-mana artifact that you can pay 5 and tap it to mill target player equal to the number of cards in their graveyard. Like that just kills your opponent pretty quickly. I think that if you're a control deck, that is a decent finisher. I wouldn't really look at those cards as like, I'm a mill deck though. It's kind of just like when I'm a control deck, I'm finishing the game with this. I guess Millstone can get there and extremely slowly. Oh, there's also Altar of Dementia. I mentioned that before, but that's another card that mills your opponent. That one's just actively good. That one's just going to kill your opponent a lot of the time without a lot of work. You just need creatures in your deck. So yeah, there's not so much a mill deck as opposed to there's just mill cards, and some of them are good and some of them aren't. Were there games I played that went to deck outs? No. I think, no, that's not true. There was one. But I didn't feel like many games were in danger of decking out. So I mentioned that the board got kind of stalled, but often something broke that parity. Like a giant creature, a giant prototype creature, or my opponent unearthing 3 things and I just like couldn't block or whatever. So while the board can stall out a little bit, there's often ways to break through. It's not often that the game's going to go to decking, I don't think. All right, so this is a pretty common question, so I will answer it. Thoughts on sealed? So I have not played any sealed, so take my words with a grain of salt. But my estimations would just be that you should play your prototype creature. Like prototype creatures are going to be big, not only because they can fill out a deck that maybe is missing a playable or two, because you could just cast them, put them in your deck as the 7-mana card, but also because games are going to go, on average, half a turn longer. Expensive cards are just going to win out a lot of the time. I will repeat my generic sealed spiel here for anybody who hasn't heard it. If you're going into any sealed format, the puzzle you are often trying to solve is how many of my good cards can I play in my pool with a reasonable mana base? Like, how many ways can I splash this awesome black bomb that I have while having like a solid red-blue base or something? And often I'm leaving equity on the table, I feel, when there's a good card in my sideboard. Now, don't go ham with that. Don't just be like, okay, play all the good cards, forget about my fixing. But I do think in this set that is, has some colorless cards, you can get away with that a little bit easier. And also, like I said, the set is pretty, although it does not seem like it has a decent amount of fixing at common and uncommon. So I don't think it's crazy to play like a 3 or 4 color deck. Obviously, I'm not saying straight 3 and 4 colors. I'm mostly saying 2 colors and a splash on either side. But that's one thing. I would also just say my other generic sealed advice is you have to play fewer bad 2-drops than you think, or you have to play fewer curve filler 2-drops than you think. Generally in draft, you have to accommodate for your curve and be like, well, I have to have some amount of cheap things, even though if they're not very good, just so I don't die. That's going to happen less often in sealed. You shouldn't ignore your 2-drop slot, but where in draft, I want like 6, 7, 8 things to do before turn 3. You're probably okay with 4 or 5, I would say, in sealed. So you're just adjusting the numbers a little bit lower. And he takes on Survivor of Koilos. So this is the 1-mana 1/1 first striker that you can exile from your grave to scry to for 2 mana. I think it's quite bad. That's the kind of card that in some sets where there are good ways to augment your creatures, like +1/+1 counters that are prevalent, or good auras or good equipment, can be pretty good because it's just a cheap thing with a keyword ability. I think that the infrastructure for that kind of card being good does not exist for the most part in this format. Now, I will say, I could see there is a place if that Warlord's Elite, the 3-mana 4/4, there is that like secret deck I was talking about where you're really going ham on those and you have like super cheap curve. I could see that being a role player there. Or I think Yoshin Dissident, which is the green-white uncommon that whenever you cast an artifact, whenever an artifact enters, you put a counter on something. If you're in that space where you happen to be like a really low to the ground aggro deck with ways to pump your creatures, yes, I think that is a playable card, but in general, it's not a huge player in the format. All right, I'm going to pack up, everybody. Next week, of course, we're going to be doing our State of the Format Address episode where we go a little bit deeper. Probably going to talk about, the top performing archetypes after week 1, my experiences after, 40, 50 drafts or whatever I do in week 1. Thank you as always. I'm going to shout out one more time. If you enjoyed, if you feel like you got something out of the deal here today, check out the Patreon, patreon.com/limitedlevelups. And if you feel like you want to do that next level of leveling up, check that out. A lot of options over there to help you do so. All right, I'm going to pack up. Thank you, everybody, for hanging out, and we'll see you later.